I want to pick up on something that you mentioned in your opening comments, and again is mentioned in the report about the 2008 mold strategy that is apparently no longer being followed. And you mentioned that neither department could indicate why or for what reason that was stopped being followed. Do you have an indication of when that seemed to occur, and any speculation as to why that simply ceased to happen?
So as I've mentioned, we've done 4 audits on housing in First Nations community, and a recommendation to develop a strategy to address mold issues across First Nations communities came from our 2006 audit. When we did a follow-up in 2008, we saw that the mold strategy wasn't being completely followed. In 2011. When we did a follow-up in 2011, we saw that it wasn't being completely followed. So it's been since then. Our audit started in 2018. You need this strategy and a plan to know how to address the problem. But what's even more concerning is that neither the department nor the Crown Corporation could tell us the magnitude of the problem. And if you want to be able to properly finance and fund and support communities to address it, you first need to understand the magnitude, gather that information, and then have a plan to fund it and tackle it.
And to follow up on that exact point, you note in 2.29 that only one of the regional offices was actually collecting data on this matter. Going beyond that, how much of a concern is there about data collection beyond simply this issue, but around other issues more generally, that the data isn't being collected from communities across the country, not only just on mold, but on other issues as well?
Well, I would tell you that that's a common finding we have in both the policing report as well as the housing report, is that there isn't data being gathered. And when you contrast it to the National Trade Corridors report that we also released today, you'll see that there was data used to make well-informed decisions. And that's really what's needed to help support First Nations communities. But I would tell you that there's, in the area of capacity, is another place where Indigenous Services Canada had not been gathering the data, and it was only recently that they surveyed many communities to find out if they had a housing manager who could help support them to understand and manage their housing issues across their community. And very few communities responded. And even then, it was clear that smaller communities were less likely to have a dedicated resource or the capacity to apply for funding, and even to help identify the extent of problems like houses in need of repair or mold in those communities.
And to that end, Section 2.37 notes that, I'm quoting here, we found that among communities of similar sizes, communities with the poorest housing conditions received less targeted funding than those with better housing, which certainly seems contradictory to what one might expect or hope to see in that situation. And again, following up, would you attribute some of that to that lack of capacity, lack of a housing manager, lack of infrastructure on the ground in terms of how that funding gets allocated?
Mm-hmm. Well, the way the program is structured is that a First Nations community has to apply for funding. So if you're less likely to have a housing manager or have awareness of funding programs there, you're not going to apply, so you're going to receive less. And we actually targeted and looked at some of the smaller communities with less than 100 housing units, and we found that when a community had self-assessed that more than 75% of their homes were in need of repair or replacement, those communities on average received less money than those who had better housing conditions. And that kind of analysis of the data is not being done by Indigenous services. And really they don't understand the needs of all the communities. So, it really does start, a well-informed decision starts with gathering data from everyone and then making your funding allocations accordingly.
Yeah, and I certainly think that's a theme that we're seeing kind of throughout the report, is that need to gather data. I think I have time for...
You've got 90 seconds.
90 seconds is lots of time. I want to follow up on, again, using old information, old data. And in 2.33, you note that we found the CMHC relied on data from Canada's 2001 census in its formula for allocating annual funding to its regional offices for its First Nations new and home repair loan program. 2001 was certainly a long time ago, and it's somewhat concerning that data from so long ago is being used to inform decisions here in, well, I guess, 2023, but into 2024 from when the audit was completed. So a kind of two-part question. First, why do you see that as a concern that such old data is being used? And second, if you could speculate as to why CMHC may have been using data from over 20 years ago to make its decisions on this matter.
So CMHC uses a funding allocation program to allocate their funds to their regional offices and provinces. Using old data, 2001 census data hasn't kept up with changes in the population for many, many years. And when CMHC updated their analysis by using the most current 2021 census data, what they discovered was that some provinces had been underfunded over the years, and other provinces had been overfunded for the years. The Crown Corporation couldn't tell us why. My take on likely one of the reasons why would be that it would mean perhaps removing funding, historical funding given to a community in order to fund another based on the fact that population growth or people have moved in different provinces versus others. So I think it's an excellent question to ask the Crown if you have the opportunity.
Thank you, and I'm sure we will.
Thank you, Chair. And I will just pick up on your last comments there. It does seem outrageous that, when it comes to something as fundamental as a roof over one's head, that, we're using old data. We're seeing examples of those communities in most need are the ones who are getting the least funding. I mean, it really does seem just out of sorts that this is happening in Canada and in Indigenous communities. It just really does seem outrageous, and I just offer that as a comment. But it does flow from what we've seen in your audits here today about some of the real lack of documentation, real lack of data to support what's happening on the ground. And one of the things that caught my eye in section 2.49 of the housing report, in which 2.49 states less than half of the projects were sampled. Specifically, the department had documentation certifying that only 8 of the 22, 36% of the projects to build new housing units we examined met the building code standards. Similarly, we found that the department had documentation certifying that only 9 of the 22, 41% repairs to existing units we examined met building code standards. That seems like a real concern from my perspective, that when we're talking about building code, not necessarily implying that they didn't meet building code, but that there wasn't documentation confirming that they met the building code. Where did you see, or how did you come to that conclusion? Was it simply they just didn't have the documentation, or that the documentation wasn't readily available, or where did that come from?
Well, from a few things. I guess I would start off by offering up that, poor quality housing is a contributor to the growth of mold, and hence why making sure that repairs and new builds meet at least the national building codes or a stricter requirement if communities would have those is important. It's a requirement in many of the funding agreements between the government and the communities. What the communities could ask for housing inspections to be done. What we saw that there was less than 1% of the new homes or builds that were being inspected. The communities told us about the lack of access to individuals who could do those inspections. But really, as you say, it doesn't mean that the builds didn't meet the codes. It's that the government doesn't have proof that that requirement within the funding agreement was being met. If I turn my comments to, I guess, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, some of their programs, when it came to repairs, did not require any of that proof, whereas new builds did require that proof. So it's about consistency to ensure that where federal money is going to be good, strong builds to help ensure that homes last longer and that mold doesn't begin to develop in those homes.
Well, and I think certainly the interconnectedness, if that's a real word, of those challenges where you see the mold, where you see the poor quality of potentially non-inspected or lack of inspections or lack of documentation confirming the inspections, it does all seem to be linked. And I think it is the challenge of having inspectors available to do some of those building inspections is certainly important. I think I have time to move on to very briefly on the First Nations Inuit policing program audit. And something that jumped out at me was in section 3.24, talking about the funds transferred to the RCMP and whether they're used for the program costs or other policing services. And you note that according to Public Safety Canada, the department last performed a review in 2018-2019 of RCMP expenditures to ensure that funds were used for the program. However, the department could not provide documentation of this review. This really surprises me that the department claims to have conducted a review but has no documentation whatsoever of said review. Could you elaborate on that? Was it simply the department says, yes, of course we reviewed it, but then there was no report that was provided, there was no paper copy of anything that actually happened with that review?
I mean, it's always concerning when we hear that something happens and there's no proof that it did happen. But I guess I would offer up that what's more concerning is that it hasn't happened since. Is that Public Safety Canada is managing the First Nations and Inuit Police Services program, and part of good governance would be to ensure that funds that you provide to a service provider, even if it is your federal partner in the RCMP, are used as intended. It's a good governance process that we would have expected to see happen, and it's one of the many reasons why we said that Public Safety Canada is really poorly managing, and there's some critical gaps in how they're managing the program.
And I certainly think this committee has had some experience with the portfolio under Public Safety Canada, and I suspect we'll probably be hearing from them again as we review this audit. So I thank you for your time.